Our brain is about short-term, shortcuts. And we have these, it's got to be about safety first. And we have these remarkable over 100 biases that are driving the show. And somehow our education and our limited understanding of the brain has converged to keep this fundamental reality that most of what happens to us is unconscious. So as we move towards the book, Michael, and the sort of the central positioning of Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge, the prelude should begin with Freud and Jung as two exemplars of popularizing this idea of the unconscious. And of course, part of that popularization, as brilliant as it was, and the thing that they did share in common, that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. That's the famous Jung quote. So Jung and Freud had this very similar sharing of the importance of what they call the unconscious. They both did on this idea that something other than our rational thinking is driving us. But beyond that, it was some brilliant observations like psychosexual development in Freud's case, from going from oral, anal, phallic, and latency phases. But in the case of Jung, equally brilliant idea of individuation and going through the anima, animus, and our shadow and archetypes and sort of moving through essentially coming to individuation. But all the time, what they had in common was the unconscious. And where they differed was in Freud's case, his obsession that this was all driven by a sexual dynamic. And in Jung's case, that it was something much deeper, much more nuanced, much more, and that there was also, he kind of came up with this other idea of the collective unconscious. So they each found their historical kind of continuity in our culture in brilliant ways, but they made it complicated. The hypnosis, the dreams, the free association, the instincts, the reality pleasure principles, the conflicts, the repression, the resistance, the sublimation. So along came Daniel Kahneman to the rescue to make the non-conscious, the unconscious, real. Like this genius of this man, and Tversky, was in a series of just such simple experiments. They came up with the idea, the data, behaviorally, it's all it was, just behavior. They used to design the experiments very quickly and run them in very short time intervals on students. And they showed that we have these biases that are non-conscious and that are rapidly, system one, system two thinking, fast thinking, that automatically, without conscious effort, impacting our decision-making. And they ran dozens of these experiments, as we know, these quick, immediate system one, fast thinking, where there's these immediate responses, minimal mental resources. It's kind of your intuition, basically, and your heuristics, these sort of rules of thumb, these shortcuts that determine through gut feelings and influenced by our emotions to make fundamental decisions in our lives. And what they did that was seminal is that they proved it. And I'll give one example, because I know this is not the time for the summary of the book, but the essence, which is what my job is, just the essence, the integrative essence. And then, of course, system two is just slower, more conscious, more detailed, time to process. It's more effortful, it's more analytical, more logical. Multiple aspects are considered before the decision is made. And as we said and have seen, that the challenge now is to reconcile these two processes. And so, quite brilliant book. What's changed, and a quick segue of what is converging the depth of the elucidation of the unconscious brain, is what I've called the non-conscious. And from the first standardized international database on the human brain that I set up, and we've discussed this for many hours now in my book, The Brain from Knowing to Doing, that there is now this scientific data, measurable, of the mechanisms that underpin the system one and system two thinking. And they are the non-conscious, which is emotion and intuition. And emotions, as we've discussed multiple times, in a fifth of a second, are the cues that determine what is threatening and what is rewarding. And our intuition uses our past experience outcomes to make predictions about the current situation. Whereas our conscious, we sort of consciously feel our body's impact of those rapid decisions. And we can measure them, heart rate, sweat rate, all sorts of gut intuition. But of course, our rational thinking is now very well elucidated, incredibly well studied, and very easy to quantify. So we now have the beginnings of the neuroscience literally deepening the insights of Daniel Kahneman and Tversky in System 1-2 thinking. And then we also have other books, like How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Susan Barrett, and with functional MRI, blood flow measures and other measures, but they're slightly slower than the measures that the cutting edge neuroscience, high time resolution signals like electrical brain function. So then let's take an example from Thinking Fast and Slow. But one example, I was just crazy how powerful this is, that they had a ring with numbers that you spun, and it always landed on the number 10 or 65. So they got people to spin the wheel. It landed on 10 and 65. They asked them an innocuous question. What percentage of African countries are in the United Nations? And if it landed on 10, the person would guess a lower number by quite a percentage, 25%, than those where it landed on 65, and they would guess that there were a higher number by 45% higher. That is astounding, that there is arbitrary numbers that influence us non-consciously, unconsciously, to make absolutely basic decisions. And there are numerous, multiple, brilliant experiments of this kind that cumulatively in that book leave you with no doubt that one of the most alarming things not to know about are 100 over 100 biases. Lastly, what is nudge? Well, nudge had a continuity. Thaler, Kahneman was his mentor. He took the book and all the wonderful research from Kahneman and Tversky and said, how can we use this? And together with Sunstein, the Harvard lawyer, they brilliantly created a field which is to use nudges, non-conscious pointers that impact on your non-conscious, unconscious brain in the same way that the bias experiments showed the light. They showed the way. Now they said, let's use this, let's apply this information. So I'm going to just give 2 personal examples and 2 society examples of why Daniel Kahneman said that this book has changed the world. It will change the world. And the reason is that we have been so over-invested in rational thinking, and we have seen that people do not necessarily respond to what's rational, but they will non-consciously choose options that may be helpful if they nudged into their brain kind of in this kind of random way. So the example is the status quo bias for personal change, that basically people who are doing their 401ks, they can procrastinate a lot. But if you basically stick it in the company sticks it in as the default option, so it's the default mode. You do a 401k. Most people just leave it there. They will go with the default option. That's how nuanced decision-making is. Most of the time, defaults work so many ways. The anchoring, which has got hundreds of marvelous ways in which we are all being gamed every day, and maybe gaming people every day through anchoring. And the simple example here is that if you tell people that other households in your area are using energy savings, you're more likely to do it. So you anchor the information in a way, and other people will go, I'm not going to be the odd person now. So non-consciously, people don't want to look foolish. But there's other examples that I love looking at. Every time I go to a restaurant, I look at how they're anchoring the pricing. And if you take wine, for example, they will often put one bottle of wine as very expensive, outrageously expensive. And then they'll give you the bottle of wine that they really want to sell you. So they'll make it $300, but for $90 and then $40, $50. And so most people feel like they're getting a bargain. And lastly, the default option that fascinates me, especially as I was a young medical student trying to convince people to donate their organs of their loved ones. It's just so hard, as you know, to go to people when somebody's just passed away and ask them to. That's a terrible time to do it. Whereas in some countries, Austria, for example, Spain, the default in your license is you donate your organs. And guess what? The default, even for something that gravitas, people stick with the status quo much of the time. And finally, and something that I think is going to be very powerful with AI, is real-time feedback. The brain loves real-time feedback because it makes the unconscious conscious. And so when you, even energy usage, when you have smart meters that tell you how much energy you're saving, or we use heart rate monitors, heart rate variability that tell you when you reduced your stress, what got you to reduce stress, by what percentage. And we find that these real-time measures, we're experimenting a lot with that at the moment, very convincing to people that they can see for themselves what works, or social examples. You can help nudge people into very fundamental changes. And it is called literally social architecture, social engineering, some people call it. There are hundreds of businesses around the world today who are social architects. And so lastly, I would say, what a marvelous other dimension in this Venn diagram is AI. To now coming back to where we started, books that wire together, fire together. But now, that fire together, wire together, but now we've got access to unprecedented information in a brain-driven manner that can help us evolve and wire our brains in ways that were just simply unimaginable.
Beautiful presentation. So intriguing and such a span. I really love the way that you brought in to the origin story of psychology. It's only 100 years old, right? And then how a beautiful bridge to Kahneman. And then Kahneman comes through with that, evidence-based. I've always had a real strong interest in nonverbal communication. What you see on the outside versus what are you picking up on here? Or what's, even like the way someone's dressed, they're not talking about what they're wearing, but it makes a difference. And then you shift to that sort of the subtle dimension of all those non-conscious, unconscious, the power of that's actually driving decision-making. So powerful. And that we could actually begin to nudge that. Amazing.
You always see the convergent element. Your nonverbal communication is such a lovely example because it brings this notion of the non-conscious and the conscious into every aspect of our interpersonal dynamics. And isn't it fascinating when somebody speaks to you, but you can see the mismatch between what they say and the intention in their voice tonality. You cannot feign sincerity, because sincerity is your intention, and your body language can sometimes give you away. And that's why, to me, the harmonization is of the non-conscious conscious in our thoughts, but it is particularly in the way we communicate. And the non-verbal communication is a language of cues. And we underestimate the power of that language. It's fascinating to me that in our speech, we all know in 95% of people that speech is activated on the left side of your brain. But on the right side of your brain are homologous areas. In other words, the same areas in the speech that allow you to move your muscles or to make of speech or to make sense of the speech. The two very famous areas in the brain anatomically have literally other homologous areas that are responsible for what's called prosody, which is your emotion, intonation. And so there's an example of we are wired with two languages. One is words and numbers, and the other is cues and body language. And it's so basic, and yet we have valued the one way greater than the other, and the other is still partially a black box. And I think AI is going to help to put the spotlight on shedding light into that black box.